What I wanted to do is maybe start the conversation. I have very few slides, 5 slides, but they are more um, walk you through kind of the thinking about AI and how we've done stuff here, especially on the product I work on, which is Microsoft Teams. And hopefully that case study kind of provokes questions for you as you are looking at your product or your service and the implications of AI. So let me start sharing the screen and um, I can talk through it. So, um, our strategy, and I'm sure you've heard it in the press, as a company for Microsoft has been really rooted in Copilot. That's the brand, that's the assistant, so to speak, that we've built that helps you get your work done. And one of the realizations in the work context, sometimes the drudgery of in work, bogs you down, and there's a lot of repetitive tasks that as information workers we all have to do. The more tools we have, the more um, data it generates, right? So the amount of noise you have to sift through, your attention is finite, and as things get more sophisticated, there's more things demanding your attention. And so, if you look at both productivity and collaboration and the way we think about it, there's a lot that can be augmented with with Copilot, with this whole Gen AI based kind of solutions. So there's two ways we think about it, right? First, like what is it that we can offer people who use our products? And this is really taking the sophistication of the large language models as well as the data that you have through using a lot of these applications, whether it's like Word, PowerPoint, Excel, Teams, and using that, in some ways, the reasoning engine, the that over your data, which is fine-tuned for the data of your company or enterprise, and with the prowess of the LLMs, like how can you help be more productive and more creative, right? That's the notion here of how we are applying that in our products. And so there's two ways you can think about it, right? It's embedded across all our apps. One of the fascinating things we see is um, the younger folks are more likely to start their journey in Copilot itself, whether they're creating a new presentation or a new concept or seeking information. Whereas for a lot of us, including myself, our mental model is very different. We decide kind of what we want to do and we pick an application to get it done, right? So if you're building a deck, you start in PowerPoint or Google Slides, whatever you use, right? And your whole model really is, application first, and that enables the task. But if you look at what the Gen AI capabilities enable is really be agnostic to the apps. And you can start your journey in Copilot where you're synthesizing, you're creating a quick representation or analysis, whatever the use case might be. And then it hands off to the app if needed, right? So we support both modes, which is you can invoke it from within the apps, but you can also start your task, your journey in Copilot itself and hand it to the apps as needed. The let me switch to kind of what we are doing in Teams. Like if you look at Copilot in Teams, what is the problem we're trying to solve? There's a few things here where we are focused on. One of the interesting things about our work today in the hybrid world is we're all in a bunch of meetings, and if you ask anyone, do they like being in meetings? The answer is overwhelmingly no, right? And so it's a little bit of a paradox where you can't get your work done without being in meetings. So that's how you collaborate, especially in a hybrid remote first world, but no one really likes that. And that's kind of the problem we see. And there's many reasons for that, right? There's fatigue, staring at the screen, things get repetitive. You have more work before and after the meeting. You don't have all the context and the information. So one of the biggest things we've been focused on is like how do you make that much better and richer, right? So some of the things that we've already launched is, you know, somebody joins late into a meeting, they can quickly get the context. They can ask Copilot, hey, what did I miss? Or if you're not able to participate in a meeting, you can get the entire summary of the meeting and you can get the action items that are assigned to you or others. And, you know, it can do pretty sophisticated things as well, right? Like, for example, if you're in a large meeting, I can ask the Copilot, hey, who hasn't participated so far? Right? Who hasn't spoken up in the meeting, and it'll give an analysis and say, hey, this particular person tends to not speak. And as a leader, it's like a lot. It's the onus is on you to draw out that participation. So there's many things like that which it does. Now there's a pre-meeting where you can actually have Copilot do all the scheduling within the meeting. If you're like looking for information, you can ask, you can get it, instead of trying to kind of figure out where it is. You can ask the context, hey, what's the latest status on X? And it'll pull based on your graph data, like it'll pull all that information. And post meetings, as I said, you can summarize, you can take meeting notes and action items. So a lot of our focus, and I bring this example as a way to kind of illustrate the problem is not new, right? Some of the problems we've talked about, like meetings and fatigue, is not new, but it's really using these capabilities to solve it in a novel way. That's really kind of what we're trying to do. Now, I often talk about the journey kind of where we are as an industry, which is, we have this sophisticated capabilities, but the time where it becomes real for an end user is when it solves some of their problems uniquely. See, the end user of your product actually does not know about what these foundational models are. They definitely don't care about whether it was trained with like X billion parameters or not. What they care about is like, is it solving anything uniquely? And so if you look at a parallel when, GPS chips became extremely inexpensive and when part of every phone and you can get this real-time location of pretty much everyone in the world, that capability by itself didn't solve any user problems. It's the applications built on that. It's the maps built on that that will give you turn by turn directions. It's the Uber that use that capability to like figure out, how to match riders with drivers. And so my point here is a lot of times the work we do as product folks, and I know this is a product audience, is really saying being aware of what is possible with the technology, but your work around identifying problems and trying to solve them, that doesn't change. It's just that you have more tools at your disposal. So that's, I think, a really important thing. And I say that because a lot of the fascination today is with the models and with what's happening in the base layer, so to speak, which is understandable because there's so much innovation happening, there's so many competitors. But I think the main work it doesn't change. The awareness and the tools you have at your disposal changes a bunch. I put down these some of these questions as a the points as a way to kind of provoke discussion. I covered some of the first one. I think the next two are also important as you're thinking about, right? One is, you have to do a little bit of retooling of your culture to build AI products. It's many ways. It's like, how do you allocate time for learning? How do you prioritize this? Even though uh, the returns are indeterminate because there's a lot of things that you'll have to do, try, build, and see if it works out. It's very similar to more than a decade and a half ago now when we went through the mobile shift, right? It wasn't, people weren't building mobile first experiences or apps or websites. But you really had to retool your culture to say, this is where the future is, and we're going to bet on mobile. I remember Meta used to have early days, iPhone came out, 5% of their usage was on mobile, everything else was on desktop, which is completely opposite from what it is today. And it required a lot of push from Mark and the leadership at Meta to move. A lot of companies made that transition, including at Google and Microsoft. And so, and I'm quoting those companies because that's where I work, so I'm giving examples from there. But you will need a similar kind of transition where you have to prioritize building some of these capabilities in your product. Because when you talk to your teams, it's very easy to say, I will get to it after I finish something that's really important because everybody's working on an existing roadmap, product, whatever it is. So I think that part is like something you really need to think through. And then the last bit I'll say is around monetization. Look, I think this is something that as an industry we're going to figure out what's the right pricing model for these capabilities once you have. Today, most of it is subscription based, and but there's an opportunity to innovate here as well. Can you do consumption based? Can you do output based? So there's a lot of, I feel like, room here for you, give specific to your industry or vertical, for you to reimagine and try different aspects of monetization. So, those are the kind of three things I want to leave with, like, in terms of discussion. I can, again, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with the audience. I can go deep into any aspect of it. I can go deep into technical stuff. But my assumption, talking to Bijan, like all of your product builders, it's like what you really need is to, um, really not lose sight of the problems, but figure out unique ways to solve it. You need to do a little bit of retooling of your culture to prioritize this, and monetization is a question, is a aspect where I think there's a lot of innovation. So those are the slides I had, hopefully as a way to prompt discussion. But I'm happy to take any questions the folks have here. Um,
Got it. Thank you so much, Amit. So people feel free to just like post your questions or send them privately to me, but maybe I'll start out with a couple of questions, especially related to the point on what problems we need to focus on, what problems that we're solving for. And there's like I can think of like kind of two challenges that people face. One is how do you identify problems that are worth being solved with AI, right? How do you identify new problems that were not explored before? And you kind of talked a little bit about this. You said, look, in many cases, we already knew the problem statement up until now, right? So the problem statement was defined. Then the question becomes, among the problems that were identified, how do you determine maybe which of them are worth paying attention to now? And say, okay, now is like with the current, you know, tech stack that's available on the AI side or the ML side, it's worth it for the company to focus on that. So what we've seen is in many cases, companies are kind of like, or like PMs are struggling to figure out, okay, there are so many different things that we could do with AI. How do we decide which ones are like worth focusing on for us, given where the current state of AI is, given I don't know, the level of accuracy, the cost structure, pricing, and everything else.
yeah, I mean, I think I have a slightly simplistic view on this, which is if you if you leave out AI, how would you prioritize your problems for your business? Like, I don't think that should change at all. Because it's not that because of these AI capabilities, you have to go search for new problems to solve. I mean, I think unless you're doing like a building a net new startup or new category of products, that's interesting. But if you are in an existing company, existing business, it's not as much as like let's go find new problems that AI can solve. It's like what are the problems we currently have that AI can solve immediately, right? So I actually do think that part in most cases should not change. Like some of the challenges I talked about in meetings like that we see, like for example, in the Teams product, these are not net new problems. Like meeting fatigue is real, people not knowing what happened, how to catch up. Like these are the problems we've always had, and we've always said, okay, how do we make things better? But what this gives you is a novel way to solve it. I think it's like some things get much easier. Doing a recap and reasoning over it and saying, tell me exactly things that I need for my job. I think that gets easier. So that's kind of point number one. I think in terms of how you prioritize, one of the challenges is like you might also realize that not every problem will require some kind of an AI solution. You can't just slap it, right? Like so sometimes it's like that's the judgment you need to have. Some of the problems you might have that are critical to you that you're staring at might just require simple product interventions. You don't need a crazy degree of sophistication. Our users are falling off in this particular funnel because here's the friction. You don't need to like now figure out what Gen AI can do. Maybe that's a simple tweak. So I am also so two things that I wanted to kind of leave with, right? One is you don't have to go search for net new problems. And second, there's no assumption that now you use AI to solve every problem that's in front of you. Now, after that small exercise of saying, here's the problems we have, which are the ones that solutions are obvious, there might be some areas where you're like, hey, this is critical. The things that we've used so far haven't worked, or we've really not solved it the ideal way. Uh, can we now bring some of these capabilities in? And I think that's where you got to like focus and maybe start with prototyping or whatever the product building steps you have in your company. But that's kind of how I would view it.
Thanks so much. It's very interesting how you're saying, like in many cases, um, you just continue with your priorities, but now maybe you have another way of solving them, that just like makes it easier for you to address them. And as long as you kind of go through product development process that you already have, that'll take care of itself. And if it's, now possible to solve a particular problem with AI and ML at a lower tech lift, great, maybe it makes it to the higher list of priorities. So that makes sense. I think one more question that was posted on LinkedIn, and I'll come to the questions on the chat here, I thought was very interesting. So Arun is asking, you mentioned younger users are more likely to start journey from Copilot, which is a really, really interesting insight. Also a really interesting insight for me. Can you please elaborate what you mean by starting the journey with Copilot? Like what would be that starting interface for these users? Like how do they actually start interacting when they're starting with the Copilot?
I mean, let's take a simple task of like building a presentation, right? And I think let's say you have to pitch a new idea, and I think a lot of the defaults for us are to go to whatever presentation software you're using, and that's where you start. Whereas, you can imagine a world in which you're not ready to build slides yet. You want to just refine the idea. You want to figure that out. You want to get your narrative right. You want to get your outline and flow right. Then you want to fill in the missing pieces. And then maybe you need help with like, what's the best way to visualize this, right? And so if you look at those steps, actually, you can use AI like Copilot in our case, and there are other things you use, but to actually go through that journey of taking an idea, crystallizing it, making it more solid, and then just a simple act. And I think a lot of that you can actually do before you build the slides. And that's what I meant by starting your journey.
That makes sense. So basically the start of the journey is a little bit earlier than it was before. That makes sense. Tarek is asking a question that I think we also talk a little bit about it in our AI product manager learning program, like rule-based versus ML-based systems, but it's worth mentioning. He's asking, like, how do you approach knowing when a problem solved with AI is better than a non-AI solution? He says he sees a lot of companies rushing to integrate AI functionality into their products, but very few have genuinely made their product better because of it. What are your thoughts on that?
So there are there are there are two ways to think about this, right? The first is, and I hear this often, hey, everybody's rushing and everybody's trying to build something, but nothing is really working yet or is as valuable yet, right? There are two ways to look at it. Yes, some of it sometimes can get very hype driven, right? So you are kind of forced to do certain things and maybe they're not ready and you are early and tinkering. So I recognize there's a little bit of that. But I go back to how things emerge when a platform shift happens. Okay. Let me give you like a really basic example. When we moved to the web, a lot of kind of e-commerce was not web native, right? Yes, they were like early kind of startups and the Amazons of the world, but the majority of the businesses, retail, didn't have a web presence, right? They were figuring it out, how to build a website, how to optimize it, how to have a shopping cart, way to do the payments, right? It didn't happen overnight. And it took a long time for that to be profitable and successful, right? And so when you were in the early days, and now I know it's tough to imagine because you take it for granted, like whatever you want, you go search and buy it. But in the early days, you could have viewed that shift from two lenses. You could have said, hey, this web thing is not working. I know a bunch of websites are trying to sell online, but you know what? Only Amazon is selling. Nobody else knows how to do it. So there's a lot of hype here. Or you could have said, this future is inevitable. And either we adapt and try to crack it, or we wait for very long, in which, you have to figure out as a business what your downside of waiting is. And that's kind of how I think about it right now. You know, not everything everybody does, you get it right. But it's like the beginning of the journey, and sooner or later you'll have to get it right in order to make that transition. So that's one way to look at it, honestly. And so if you want to just separate out the hype, you can say, hey, this is all hype, will go away, let me just carry on. And that could be a reasonable approach you take. But the way we are approaching this, or way a lot of the companies are saying, hey, this shift is inevitable. We're in the early stages and we need to learn and adapt to it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks so much for that. So, a few more questions. Another question from Subut, and I'll come to your question, Anubhav, in a bit. But I thought Subut's question is very interesting. He's asking, is there a novelty factor for Gen AI, for example, like with summarization, auto-generating responses for teams and things like that, that like kind of got that early traction. And the reason he's asking is he's wondering, like, do people just like try it a lot at first and they kind of drop off, or do you see that that excitement with like Gen AI use cases continue to exist as time goes by? And do people like kind of continue using it, or after a while, the novelty factor goes away, the usage goes down?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's definitely a novelty factor with all of these things, that because they're net new, and so people want to give it a spin, they want to try it. But the way I think about it is again no different from whether it's AI or not. Like, so think about, like, let's take summarization for an example, right? Um, Capabilities like this are, you have to realize you have the right expectations and metrics for these kind of things. Now, do we expect people to summarize stuff 10 times a day? Probably not, right? Is it like, do I expect users to keep using this functionality over and over again? Probably not, right? When is it the most useful? Hey, you had gone on a vacation, you came back, you really are under information overload and you want to summarize. There's a big chat happening with lots of kind of context, and suddenly you get added, and somebody says, "Hey, what do you think?" And you're like, "Oh my God, like I have no idea what's going on." You missed a meeting. You want to know what happened, or you couldn't make it because you had an appointment to a certain thing. So it's useful there. And so the point I'm trying to make it is just because it's AI doesn't mean somebody has to keep using it all the time, right? Your use case has to be pertinent. You know, you have to know, hey, what is the frequency of it? Is it a weekly thing? Is it a daily thing? Is it a monthly thing? Whether it's AI or not, that's simple product 101, right? If you're working on TurboTax, your metric cannot be daily active users, right? People come back to you once a year. And so I think that's the lens you have to look at, irrespective of AI.
That makes sense. Thanks. I can see a couple questions also being asked on LinkedIn, and I'll come back to the Zoom questions in a minute. They're asking like, what are some of the challenges that you think AI product manager face when they're trying to basically work in a world where AI is becoming more and more relevant. Maybe another question is also like very in tangent to this. They're asking like, what are the challenges you see when tuning the team culture for adopting AI? So basically, in a world where AI is becoming more and more of a foundational technology, um, how do you basically address some of the challenges, and what sort of challenges do you foresee AI product managers be facing?
I mean, I think there's a lot of them, right? So first, obviously, is the field is changing, advancing so fast. So just the ability to learn and keep up, I think it's not easy, right? Um, the pace is incredible and it requires a lot of dedication to kind of make sure things that happen now can become irrelevant in like a couple of weeks. And so that's obviously the keeping up is a challenge. I think the when you're going through the act of building the product, right, there are many challenges. Like what's your evaluation criteria? Look, these are probabilistic models, right? These are answers are probabilistic, and if you apply it to something where you need utmost accuracy, you have to kind of surmount that. You have to fine tune it. You have to scope it. So how you evaluate what you're building, what's the success measures, what are the metrics? I think that's something that's a challenge. It's evolving. You have to apply different things. How do you assess the quality of the data and do it responsibly? That's not trivial either, right? Like you want to make sure um, there's the steps around responsible, but like also how you build your models where who has access to what kind of data. That's important. So there's many things here that it's new. We're all kind of tweaking our product building mechanisms because what we did, the old kind of ways of saying, I'm just going to A/B test something and figure out the results. It's you need to have a little bit more sophistication in kind of how you go about that. So my point is like none of this is easy because there's no like 5 years from now we'll be in a mature state. And so it'll be very clear, there'll be frameworks and how to do this. But since we are early, there are a lot of unknowns, and so I totally acknowledge them.
That makes sense. Thank you. So, there are more questions that are being posted. I think one question is a little bit different also, is there's no strong legal framework defining what AI can and cannot do. And in light of this, like how do we ensure that we're building a product that is regulatory safe, maybe we can call it, based on available models, and doesn't get the company into trouble. Like I'm sure a lot of the PMs are being pushed back by the compliancy team or privacy team. And it's a good question. Like, how do we actually still find a path forward, given that we're getting maybe pushbacks from the more conservative or like sections of the company that are responsible for compliance and privacy?
Yeah, I think, look, there's just two ways I'll answer this. One, if you're talking about like a legal framework coming from um, like a government entity or whatever, like I think that a lot of that stuff will happen. Some of that is in the works. But when you start in like new innovation, it's not like you have a legal framework existing for that. Like there was no legal framework to like when internet came about, or how a lot of this stuff happened, because it it has to the framework has to kind of catch up and understand the implications with the product building. I do think in the app, what you can do, what we do here is like we have a responsible AI framework, which is talks about what principles we have, how do we adhere to those principles, what process we follow during. It's not like willy nilly you can just build an AI feature and launch it, right? We go through a lot of steps in every stage to figure out what is it that we need in terms of like how do you data security, like the privacy, not having bias. And so I do think the heart of this question is like really you want to innovate, but you also want to do responsibly, right? And that's the balance you have to strike, which I think is more important given how many unknowns are right now. So I would strongly say like build a framework for your company for how to do responsible AI and processes so that you can do checks and safeguards. Yes, it will slow you down sometimes, but I do think the upside is higher to be careful early on than later.
Makes sense. Um, gonna share the question. Okay, so I think the question that Priyanka is asking, um, it's I'll share it. Feel free to share like, it needs more context because I feel like it's very industry specific. She's asking, what are some of the cost-effective strategies that smaller companies can adopt to leverage AI for their business operation? Um, they it seems inevitable, but they're wondering how do they make sure they don't fall behind.
I mean, I think if you're a smaller company, your asset really is um, the data that you have, or the niche or the vertical that you are in, and your ability to kind of fine tune for that. See, not like building these large models, frontier models, and it's super expensive. It's not like every company can do that, right? So like the opportunity really is to how do you apply to your specific domain and tune it to your domain and the expertise that you have in understanding the problem, right? You take healthcare, or you take travel. I mean, there's so many things you can do where you really focus on so to speak, customizing for that particular problem set. And I think that's where a small company, um, has the advantage and focus.
Thank you. Chaitali is asking a interesting question that we've also learned it's sometimes hard to predict when do you actually deliver the final product in a way that's actually valuable to the user, right? So the question is, one challenge in different novel, one challenge in like, a lot of these deep learning models that are being trained is that it's kind of hard to estimate the timeline and kind of reaching a point where you can basically ship the product. So how do you break this into like tangible targets, like, experimentation, testing, maybe reaching a particular desired accuracy rate? Like, how do you actually project manage something that has like so much unknown, and it's kind of hard to see when it eventually reaches a point where you can deliver value to the users, is the question.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it's a good question. Look, it's when you're trying to innovate, it's tough to have very fixed timelines. That is the challenge, right? Whether it's AI or not. Like if you're trying to build something new or try something new, you can't say, 6 months, this many users we're gonna have. So I think that's always a challenge. And I think it baked in your question is in some ways the answer to that, right? Which is how do you start with small set of users, cohorts? How do you try things? How do you experiment, go back? I also think it's that's kind of the sequencing you have to follow, right? You can't be in a place where we're not there yet, where you can just launch something and assume everything's gonna work. Like there's no guaranteed stuff like that. So my other point here would be like also setting the right expectations. I do think one of the things that happens in this hype cycle is like there's a mismatch in expectations, from all sides. How much do users expect? How much does your kind of business leader expect? With from the reality of where you are in trying to innovate, and there is a mismatch because people are like, that's what happens in a sometimes we get ahead of ourselves, and so I think just calibrating that to say, hey, we don't know if this is going to work and what the outcomes are, but here's a set of things we're going to try, and here's the evaluation criteria. I think that's a much better way to approach this.
Makes sense. Kareem asked the question of why do you think people hate the AI when it comes to customer support, specifically in telecommunication companies? Like, I'm not following you. Maybe Kareem, you can kind of explain this a little bit more. Do you want to share what you have in mind? I don't know if Kareem is like, yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, Bijan. So, what I'm like referring to is when you call the customer support to any like cell companies or like Verizon, for example, and you keep bothering by the wrong choices or the when you're asking like someone to, you need a human to call so he or she can understand your problem. Like it happens like different times with me. Like I need a human to talk. I don't want an AI or chatbot or any of this stuff to understand my problem very quickly and propose a solution. So many of my friends, including me, like we hate this and we wait until the end of the options so we can talk to a human. How do you think, like, why it didn't work in this field at least? Or what's your thoughts about it?
I don't know, honestly, why they hate it. I mean, look, these are um, some of these are older IVR systems, speech recognition systems, right? And I wouldn't assume that these are all like AI powered or anything, and they might not be as sophisticated um, as they need to be, and who probably will get there. But that's what I can think of. Um, like because the voice based customer support has been there for a while, and so there's many different systems companies have used, and not all of them are like cutting edge, and so these things will get better. Customer support is always frustrating. I mean, it's got like nothing to do with AI.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of things that people also mentioned, which is interesting, is like, I think what you're discussing here is like more of a chatbot, Kareem, whereas the new generation is like mostly like kind of conversational AI that enables so many other things. So that's a very maybe the product is very different now, right?
Yeah,
Like to Amit's point, it just takes some time for these products to make their ways into the production environment, especially when you're dealing with enterprise. That makes sense. Okay, so one question that's asked from Jackie is like, have you seen instances where AI comes in and actually changes a product strategy or redefines the customer problems that you're solving. So, yeah, I guess to your point, in many cases, you already know the problem statement, but maybe that problem statement was defined when you had this kind of like narrow definition of the set of tool sets that are available to you or the set of solutions that are available to you. And they're asking like, how do you actually, maybe redefine the problem with now AI being a solution that could solve maybe better problems or harder problems. And have you seen instances where it actually changed the product strategy because of that?
I mean, definitely, like if I take my company's example, Microsoft's example, it has redefined our strategy, right? Like a lot of it is now Copilot based, and it is we have this now amazing tool to augment kind of what you're doing, whether it comes to collaboration and productivity. So it's definitely the space we play in the kind of customer problems we try to solve. Uh, are similar. They're not net new, but like the way we're approaching it, the strategy has changed where you have a lot more assisted things that can do on your behalf, can make sense of information a lot faster, can generate things a lot faster. So productivity, we think of productivity as completely getting redefined with these tools. So yeah, it definitely has changed our strategy as you've seen.
Makes sense. And there's a really interesting question also posted on LinkedIn. They're asking like, as a product leader, who's like hiring the next generation of product managers, and particularly AI product managers, what sort of skills or qualities or experience are you looking for that would make you say, okay, this is a good candidate for an AI product manager role?
Yeah. Look, I think it's very difficult at this point to say like you a candidate must have a extensive background in AI, right? Like there's not as many people who've done that. Having that background is obviously great and preferred, but for a large majority of the folks, it's new, they're learning and adapting to this. I would say the core skill of like, do you have the curiosity and the open-mindedness to learn and the hunger to learn? I think that's the key thing to look for in the candidate, right? For instance, like if you're the kind of person who's saying, look, I have been, whatever, I'm a mid manager, I'm a senior person, I've worked for 15 years, here's all the stuff I know. Um, and you're solely banking on that, it's really difficult because the approach we all need is we're all kind of day one of this thing. And, are you willing to roll up your sleeves and learn and apply and have that curiosity? I think that's the key thing that I would look for in a candidate.
So curiosity is kind of like having the willingness to learn the new stuff. How important is it for them that they've worked in an AI first company, or like what sort of signs would get you more interested in them in the context of AI specifically? Like,
Yeah,
do
I
you
would
want
say,
them to see like, they did a project on the side, or they worked in AI, or like they have a thought leadership? Like, what do you want to see there?
I mean, I think it's less so on product folks, right? Like, unless it's a very specialized role, like when you're looking at like data scientists and engineering, you need a lot more of that, little bit of the specialization. So on product, it's a bonus if you have that experience, but it's not a deal breaker simply because, as I said, it is, it's not like we've been doing this for so long that we expect so many people to have experience building and trying product. Now, things that stand out are if you really are tinkering and building something and learning something, I think that obviously shows that you have the curiosity and you have the hunger to kind of adapt to this. So that definitely helps. But I don't think like I expect like a massive background in having done this before because it's still learning.
Makes sense. That's great. All right, let me see if there are any other questions. We have been receiving a bunch of people posting questions on LinkedIn, and I think I've answered most of the questions here. Has there been a question that anybody wanted to really ask that we haven't answered yet? If there is, like, I think now is the time for you to kind of speak up and share your thoughts. Otherwise, I think we go ahead, Ankit, go ahead.
Hi, Amit. Thank you for providing this amazing content. Yeah, I've been following you on LinkedIn also. So, yeah, new context matters. So, I think for a company like Microsoft, which is becoming under Satya Nadella's leadership, very much an AI first company, what about other companies which are not actually AI first companies, but are moving towards that, looking at the power that GPT has provided under transform architecture? Like, would love to get some specific advice. I know you've not worked, like you've already worked in this AI first companies, but maybe you're advising some companies. You can give some specific tactics, like how to move towards becoming more and more AI first companies, so that we can increase the number of AI products that we can build, which will really deliver value for the company and for the customers.
Yeah. Look, I mean, whether you're AI first or not, and how to quantify that, I won't get into that. But I think what is important is what I think what is important is for you to not punt this thing. And what I mean by punt is kick it down the road, so to speak. And it's not like I expect every company to suddenly come with like a great AI feature product line that's just like capturing the market for them. That's not the expectation. But being aware and having your teams and your org spend time learning this stuff, hacking with this stuff, prototyping this stuff, trying this stuff. Don't delay that, because I think you're just going to be better off as a company in just building that learning culture, and not saying, I have so many priorities, let me just take 6 months, finish it, then I will get to it. Because so you don't have to AI first, which means like you've dropped everything, but definitely you'll have to be intentional to carve out that time and learn and keep up with this stuff and play around with it. So don't delay that. That's my only thing.
Thank you, Amit.
Don't delay that as a company, as a team, as a whatever culture, and as a person. It's like
Exactly. Yeah. We are moving towards that. Like maybe I think we are on that journey. Like, so I'm leading all this AI initiatives across multiple products there. Like, so yeah, I should really still deep down. There's so many other priorities which coming up. So yeah,
there
I
always are. And I think what really also helps is, when you build and show something to your colleagues and to your leadership that has the promise, hey, we could solve it this way. That's a lot more than saying, oh, everybody should learn and everybody should read, because sometimes you just kind of have to anchor it with the showing that possibility. And that goes a lot more. Like one great demo will spur a lot more curiosity and learning than you saying, here's the books to read and here's the article you should read, because people are
got
like,
it.
I don't have time for that.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much, everybody. Hope you guys all enjoyed the session. If there's anything else anybody wants to ask, please raise your hand and we can give you the floor to quickly ask your question. Okay, no questions. I'm quickly looking at LinkedIn as well to see if there are any other questions. Perfect. Looks like we've answered everything. Thank you so much, Amit. Really appreciate you coming today. I hope that people found today's session interesting. I think the key thing that really resonated with me was this note that there is a new segment of the users that are kind of starting with AI, which is kind of like the younger generation with the Copilot, whereas us, maybe the millennials, we don't do that. We're still starting with the application, with the kind of the SaaS application. So that was a very interesting note for me, and the example that you gave on how, if you looked at how mobile became more and more relevant in the context of Facebook, you would see similar behavior. That was very interesting. And thank you so much for sharing that. So, for those of you who are interested, like we said, today is the last day to join our AI product manager cohort. Thank you so much. And I want to just mention, Lisa, please do not post your LinkedIn URL here. We're just trying to have a conversation on AI product management. So thank you so much, Amit. Really appreciate you joining us, and we hope to see you soon again in our community. Really appreciate you coming, Amit.
Thanks for having me.
Have a good day. Bye.
So my experience with the cohort was overwhelmingly positive. I wasn't sure what I was getting into, but I mean, look, this is what we did in 4 weeks. I mean, for me, this is like, wow. In 4 weeks class, we came up with all of this much research, this much understanding, all of it in 4 weeks. That's pretty amazing. And so firstly, how thorough the course is, how we go, you just dive in and really all the deep concepts from the technical side to all of the PM work that you have to do, all of it is covered thoroughly. The technical side especially, it's very easy to kind of gloss over it, but this ML is so technical, you absolutely have to know it on some level. The instructors are very supportive. Kai is a fantastic instructor. Bijan is always available for help. He wants to help you push your career forward, learn as much as possible, just become a great AI PM. And that's two hearty thumbs up.